The silence of the high desert was a language only the grieving could speak. Elias Thorne had been fluent in it for 10 years. It was in the sigh of the wind through the ponderosa pines that bordered his land, in the vacant space beside him in the wide bed, in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that fell upon a floor no longer scuffed by a second pair of boots. His ranch, nestled in a valley of scarred mesas and unforgiving rock, was not a home. It was a tombstone he had chosen to live in, a monument to the woman the fever took and the future she had taken with her. His days were a ritual of fences and livestock, movements so worn into his muscles they required no thought. He mended what was broken, fed what was hungry, and watched the sun rise and set with the stoic indifference of the mountains themselves. His heart was a locked room, the key long since buried with Sarah. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, bone, sinew, and a pain so profound it had become a form of peace. He asked for nothing from the world, and in return, the world had the decency to leave him alone. Until the day it didn't. It came as a hesitation in the late afternoon heat, a disruption to the rhythm of his solitude. 3 figures, shimmering in the distance, walking with the desperate slowness of the nearly broken. He watched them from the porch, his hand resting on the smooth, worn stock of the rifle that was always near. He was not a man who feared trouble, but he was one who fiercely guarded his quiet. As they drew closer, their shapes resolved. Apache. An old woman, a younger one, and a child. They stopped at the edge of his hard-packed yard, their bare feet stained with the red earth. The oldest woman's face was a beautiful map of hardship, her eyes dark and deep as a well. The younger one, clearly the mother, held the small girl's hand in a grip that was both anchor and shield. Her gaze was defiant, a flicker of flame in a field of exhaustion. The child, no older than 5, hid behind her mother's leg, her dark eyes wide with a fear that was older than her years. Elias said nothing. He waited, a granite figure on his porch, letting the silence press down on them. It was a test and a warning. Finally, the mother stepped forward. Her voice was dry, cracked like the creek bed in a drought. "Water," she said, the single English word a heavy stone cast into the quiet. He gave a curt nod toward the pump near the barn. He expected them to drink and move on. That was the transaction. A small measure of humanity for the preservation of his isolation. But after they drank, cupping the cool water in their hands, they did not leave. They stood there, a triptych of silent appeal under the vast, indifferent sky. The mother spoke again, her voice stronger now. "Shelter. For the night." The word struck the door of his locked heart. No. It was the only answer he had. This place was his and his alone, saturated with a grief he refused to share or dilute. "Keep moving," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "There's nothing for you here." It was the old woman who answered, not with a plea, but with a statement. Her English was softer, laced with the cadence of her own tongue. "There is much here," she said, her eyes drifting to the faded gingham curtains in the kitchen window, the one Sarah had sewn. "Much noise, for such a quiet place." Elias felt a cold shock, as if she could see the ghosts that were his only company. He saw the mother flinch at the old woman's words, a quiet reprimand passing between them. He looked at the child, who was now staring at a small, crudely carved wooden horse sitting on the porch rail, a thing he'd whittled one winter years ago for a son he and Sarah had planned for. The girl's gaze was one of pure, unadorned longing. He was a dam of stored sorrow, and for the first time in a decade, a crack appeared. He let out a long breath, the sound of a surrender. "The barn," he grunted, pointing with his chin. "One night. At sunrise, you're gone." The mother, Nita, nodded, her pride of visible armor. The old woman, Iska, offered a look that was not gratitude, but something deeper, an understanding. The child, Kamalis, gave the wooden horse one last, wistful look before being led away. Elias watched them go, the sight of them, a family, however fractured, an ache in his chest. He retreated into his house, the silence inside suddenly feeling less like peace and more like a punishment. The next morning, the sun found him already awake. He'd slept poorly, the presence of others on his land a weight on his consciousness. He walked toward the barn, his resolve hardened. They had to go. But as he rounded the corner, he stopped. Kamalis was sitting in the dirt, the small wooden horse in her hands. She was making it gallop through imaginary canyons, whispering to it in her own language. Nita stood guard nearby, her posture tense, ready for the eviction. Before Elias could speak, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road, fast and heavy. Not the slow plod of a farmer's wagon, but the disciplined canter of riders with purpose. A knot of dread tightened in Elias's stomach. He motioned sharply for Nita and the child to get back inside the barn, out of sight. 4 men rode into his yard, led by a figure who sat his horse with an air of absolute authority. Colonel Redding was a man carved from ambition and cruelty. He wore clean, tailored clothes that seemed an affront to the dust of the valley, and his face, handsome and sharp, held a contempt for everything he surveyed. His men were rough, carrying repeating rifles with casual menace. "Thorn," Redding said, his voice smooth and condescending. He didn't dismount. "A man could die of loneliness out here. A man could die of other things," Elias replied, his tone flat. He stood his ground, a silent barrier between the riders and the barn. Redding's smile was thin as a razor's edge. "I'm looking for government property. 3 strays. A crone, a squaw, and her whelp." They slipped a patrol up north. Word as they came this way. He scanned the ranch, his eyes lingering on the barn. "You're a law-abiding man, aren't you, Thorn? You know the penalty for harboring fugitives from a federal reservation." The moment hung in the air, thick and volatile. Behind him, in the shadows of the barn, were 3 human beings. In front of him was the law, or what passed for it, a brutal system of displacement disguised as progress. For 10 years, Elias had existed between worlds, belonging to neither. Now, he was being forced to choose a side. He thought of the child's hands on the wooden horse. He thought of Iska's knowing eyes. "Haven't seen anyone," Elias said. The lie was simple, but it was the heaviest thing he'd lifted in a decade. "The only thing that's passed through here is the wind." Redding stared at him, a long, appraising look. He saw the ex-soldier in Elias's stance, the hardened settler in his gaze. He didn't believe him, but he couldn't prove the lie. Not yet. "A word of advice," Redding said, gathering his reins. "The wind in this valley is about to change. Make sure you're not standing on the wrong side when it does." He wheeled his horse and rode out, his men following like vultures. The threat lingered long after they were gone. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had crossed a line. His quiet war with grief had just become a real one. He turned to the barn, his face set like stone. "Get in the house," he said to Nita, who emerged from the shadows, her face a mask of wary disbelief. "All of you. They'll be back." The barn was no longer sanctuary enough. He had unknowingly invited the world back into his life, and now its most dangerous parts were hammering at the door. Bringing them into the house was like letting a river flow through a desert. The silence was the first casualty. It was filled with the soft murmur of Iska's chanting as she prepared herbs, the whisper of Nita's Apache words to her daughter, and, most jarringly, the sound of Kamalis's tentative laughter as she rediscovered the wooden horse, which Elias had gruffly placed on the kitchen table. The house began to smell of strange, savory foods, of cedar smoke and something wild and alive that pushed back against the stale scent of sorrow. Iska, the grandmother, moved through the rooms with a quiet authority, as if she knew their secrets. She would pause by the fireplace where Sarah's portrait once hung, her eyes seeming to trace its absent shape. "A house should not hold its breath," she told him once, her voice gentle. "It will sicken and die." Nita remained a creature of coiled tension. She watched Elias with a hawk's intensity, judging his every move. She saw the skill in the way he cleaned his rifle, the economy of his movements as he worked. There was a respect growing between them, unspoken and wary. He was a protector, but he was still a white man, the face of the world that had taken everything from her people. Days turned into a week. A fragile, unspoken truce settled over the ranch. Elias taught Nita how to sight down the barrel of his spare rifle. She, in turn, showed him which plants growing in the canyon could stop a fever and which could hide a human scent. Iska told stories to Kamalis by the fire, ancient tales of Coyote and the stars, and Elias found himself listening from the shadows, the words of balm on a wound he thought was numb. The peace was an illusion. Redding's presence was a tightening noose around the valley. One morning, the creek that watered Elias's modest herd ran dry. He rode upstream and found the reason: a crudely built dam, manned by two of Redding's men. They grinned at him from across the diverted water. "Colonel's orders," one of them called out. "This land is being reassessed." It was a siege. Starve him out. Force his hand. He had to go to town for supplies, a journey he now made with a loaded rifle and a sense of profound dread. The town of Redemption, once a place of grudging respect for him, had turned cold. Faces turned away as he passed. The sheriff, a man named Cobb who owed his badge to Redding's influence, met him outside the general store. "Heard you've had some visitors, Elias," Cobb said, not meeting his eye. "Redding has a government contract. He's clearing the territory for new settlement. It's the future." "You're standing in the way of progress." "Since when is progress starving a man's cattle?" Elias asked. "Since he offered a bounty for 3 Apache runaways." The sheriff replied, his voice low. $500. A lot of money for folks around here. You keep them on your land, Elias, and it's not just Redding you'll have to worry about. It's everyone. He returned to the ranch with meager supplies and a heavy heart. He was an island, and the sea was rising. That night, as the storm gathered over the mesas, Iska found him on the porch, staring out at the darkness. The air was electric with tension, both inside and out. "The man with the silver buttons," she began. "He hunts my granddaughter not for the law, but for the land she stands on." Elias looked at her, waiting. "Our people have a holy place in these canyons," Iska explained, her voice a low hum against the rising wind. "A place of winter sanctuary, granted by a treaty with the Blue Coats long ago. It is marked by 3 red sisters, mountains that weep in the spring. That land is worthless for grazing, but there is silver in its veins. This Redding knows. To claim it, he must erase the treaty. And to erase the treaty, he must erase the people who remember it." Her words painted the final, brutal piece of the picture. This wasn't about 3 fugitives. It was about greed, sanctioned by a corrupt system. "He believes we are ghosts," Iska continued, her gaze piercing. "All he has to do is prove it. Show that we no longer exist here. Then the land and the silver is his." Elias looked at his hands, callous from a decade of meaningless labor. His work had been about holding on to the past. But what if it could be about fighting for a future? Not his own, but one for the child asleep inside, for the women who had breached his walls. The grief inside him, a cold, heavy stone for so long, began to feel like fuel. "Sarah," he said, the name a strange and painful sound on his lips. "My wife. She was a teacher. She loved books, papers, records." A desperate idea, a flicker of light in the storm, began to form. He went to the old chest at the foot of his bed, a repository of Sarah's life he hadn't touched in 10 years. He lifted the lid, the scent of lavender and old paper rising like a spirit. He dug past faded linens and pressed flowers, his hand searching for something he wasn't sure even existed. And then he found it. Tucked inside a leather-bound volume of poetry was a folded, brittle document. It was a territorial survey map, commissioned by the federal government 20 years prior. And in Sarah's elegant, precise hand, a series of notes in the margins, cross-referencing the official survey with local histories she had been collecting. One note stood out. It described a sacred Chiricahua site, a winter haven, protected by an old, obscure treaty rider. It was marked on the map, a small patch of land designated as sovereign, precisely where Iska had described, in the shadow of the 3 red-topped mesas. Redding's claim was a fraud. He wasn't enforcing the law, he was breaking it. The plan came to him then, born of desperation and a strategist's mind he thought he'd left behind on the battlefields of the war. He couldn't fight Redding's men. He couldn't fight the town. But he could fight a lie with the truth. He laid the map on the table. Iska, Nita, and Elias stood around it, a council of war under the flickering lamplight. "The federal marshal at Fort Grant," Elias said, his finger tracing a long, treacherous route across the map. "He's a hard man, but an honest one. If he sees this, with the territorial seal, he'll have to act. Redding's authority comes from a regional office, but the marshal's comes from Washington. The journey is 2 days through open country," Nita said, her eyes already calculating the risks. "Redding's men are watching every road. They will be watching me," Elias corrected her. "I'll draw them away. I'll give you a day's head start." He looked at Nita, the warrior mother. "You are faster than any horse in these canyons. You know the hidden paths. You can make it." Iska placed a hand on her daughter's arm. "The spirits of the ancestors will guide your feet." Nita looked from her mother to her daughter, then to Elias. The mistrust in her eyes was finally eclipsed by something else, a fragile, powerful alliance. "I will not fail," she said. At dawn, Nita was gone, a ghost melting into the pre-dawn shadows, a copy of the precious map wrapped in oilskin and tucked against her heart. Elias, Iska, and Kemalis remained. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the held breath before the charge. Elias spent the morning making his preparations. He checked his rifle, filled his saddlebags, and left a store of food and water for Iska and Kemalis, barricading them in the house. Then he rode out, not east toward Fort Grant, but west, directly into the heart of Redding's territory. He made no effort to be subtle. He rode onto a high ridge, a clear silhouette against the morning sun, a deliberate and open challenge. It didn't take long. A signal flare went up from a nearby outpost. Soon, Redding and a half-dozen of his men were thundering toward him. The chase was on. This was Elias's land. He might not own it by law or deed, but he owned it in blood and sweat and memory. He led them not on a race, but on a strategic unraveling. He plunged into a narrow box canyon he knew had a hidden exit, forcing them to follow single file, slowing their advance. He triggered a small rock slide with a well-aimed shot, blocking their path and forcing a long detour. He used the land as his weapon, the echoes and twisting ravines as his allies. He was a phantom, always just out of reach, pulling them deeper and deeper away from the ranch, away from the route Nita was taking. By late afternoon, his horse was exhausted, and so was he. Redding, infuriated and obsessed, finally cornered him in a natural amphitheater of rock, a dead end. His men fanned out, rifles raised. Elias dismounted, his own rifle held loosely at his side. He was out of tricks. Redding strode forward, his face flushed with triumph. "It's over, Thorn. You're grand, noble gesture is finished. Did you really think one broken-down rancher could stop the march of progress? You're a traitor to your own kind. For what? A pack of savages. They're not savages, Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying in the enclosed space. They're a family. Something you wouldn't understand. I understand property, Redding sneered. And they were on mine. Just like you are now. He raised his pistol. This is the last piece of land you'll ever set foot on. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafeningly loud in the sudden stillness. And then another sound broke the silence. The clear, ringing call of a cavalry bugle. From the ridge above them, a line of blue-coated soldiers appeared, rifles at the ready. At their head was a man with a graying mustache and the insignia of A.U.S. Marshal on his chest. Nita stood beside him, her face grim but victorious. The marshal rode down into the amphitheater, his horse picking its way carefully through the rocks. He dismounted and walked toward Redding, ignoring Elias completely. "Colonel Redding," the marshal said, his voice like iron, "I have in my possession a sworn affidavit and a territorial survey map, confirming that your current operations are in direct violation of the 1858 Sanctuary Treaty. You are hereby ordered to cease all activities and withdraw your men. You're also under arrest for the illegal detainment and persecution of protected persons." Redding's face went from disbelief to rage to a pasty, bloodless white. His power, built on bluster and brutality, evaporated under the cold light of actual law. He looked from the marshal to Nita, his expression one of pure venom. He had been undone not by a bullet, but by a piece of paper in the hands of a woman he considered less than human. His men, seeing their authority vanish, lowered their rifles. The siege was broken. The sun was setting when Elias returned to the ranch, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley. The creek was flowing again. Nita was already there, standing with Iska on the porch. When Kemalis saw him, she ran into the yard, her small legs churning. She didn't run to her mother, but to him. She wrapped her arms around his leg, her face buried in the rough denim of his trousers. He hesitated for a moment, his hands hovering in the air, uncertain. Then, slowly, he reached down and rested a hand on her head. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person in 10 years. It felt like coming home. He looked up at the house, at the two women on the porch. Iska gave him a small, knowing smile. Nita simply watched him, her gaze no longer holding suspicion, but a deep, unshakable respect. A bond forged in shared peril and a common victory. The ranch was still quiet, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of peace, of safety. It was the sound of a house breathing again. He watched the small girl, a bluebird in the golden grass, and for the first time in a decade, the silence did not answer back.